always imagined my daughter's graduation would be one of the proudest days of my life. The kind of moment you hold on to when the house gets quiet and the nights stretch out a little longer than you'd like. The kind of memory that gives your heart something to lean on when everything else starts to shift and slip away. I spent weeks planning what I'd wear, carefully steaming a soft blue dress I'd kept tucked in the back of my closet, saving it for something that truly mattered. I even got my hair done at the little salon on the corner where they still remember your name and ask how your garden's doing. I told them I wanted something that said, "Elegant Mother," and not "trying too hard." Something that would show up nicely in pictures, but still feel like me. That morning, I woke up early, made cinnamon rolls just like when our daughter Emma was little, and smiled to myself because everything finally felt like it was falling into place. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of that day, everything I thought I could rely on, my marriage, my future, my own reflection in the mirror, would be cracked wide open. Tom, my husband of 22 years, was quiet that morning, sipping his coffee like it was a chore, not a comfort, flipping through the news on his phone without saying much of anything. He hadn't even touched the cinnamon rolls, which honestly should have been my first clue, because Tom never skipped breakfast unless he was sick, angry, or hiding something. But I didn't want to start the day with suspicion. I wanted peace. I told myself maybe he was just nervous, emotional. Maybe this was hitting him harder than he thought. He loved Emma dearly, or at least I always believed he did, even if he showed it in strange, stiff ways that never quite matched the softness I tried to keep alive in our home. I gently reminded him what time we needed to leave, and he nodded without looking up, muttering something like, "I'm getting ready," and disappeared into the bathroom. Emma was already dressed when she came downstairs, glowing in her white cap and gown, her face lit up with the kind of smile that makes your heart swell and ache all at once. I could barely stop myself from crying when I hugged her, not because I was sad, but because I was so proud, so full of everything we had overcome to get her to this point. The late nights studying, the tears over heartbreaks, the early mornings we both hated. I looked at her and saw the best thing I had ever done, the truest proof that something good had come from all these years of holding this family together with my own two hands. We drove together in Tom's car, the three of us in silence, except for Emma occasionally adjusting the radio or checking her lip gloss in the visor mirror. I reached over and touched Tom's hand once, just gently, the way I used to when we were younger, when a touch could still say everything, but his fingers felt cold, stiff, like they didn't remember me anymore. Still, I didn't let my heart go there. Not yet. I stared out the window and told myself it was just nerves, just the weight of a big moment. The ceremony itself was beautiful. One of those perfect early summer afternoons where the sky looks like a painting and the air feels like a soft hug. We sat with friends, our longtime neighbors, some of Emma's childhood friends and their families. Everyone was chatting, laughing, passing around tissues as their kids walked the stage. I held Tom's hand again as Emma's name was called, and for a moment, just that brief little slice of time, I believed that maybe we were okay, that maybe whatever I'd been feeling was just in my head. We stood and clapped and smiled as our daughter accepted her diploma, her eyes searching the crowd until they found ours, and I swear to you I saw her smile just a little wider when she saw me. Then everything changed. After the ceremony, we gathered in the reception hall that the school had so thoughtfully decorated with string lights, fresh flowers, and big banners congratulating the class of the year. And everything had that golden, glowy feeling that sits right on the edge between joy and nostalgia, like you're celebrating something, but also quietly mourning the way time moves forward, whether you're ready or not. Emma was beaming, surrounded by her friends, hugging people she hadn't seen in years, and even though my feet were already aching in those pale heels I hadn't broken in properly, I felt like I could float because my baby had made it. And for once, the world felt right, like it had paused just long enough for me to take one deep breath of peace. We were sitting at a round table near the front, Tom and I next to each other, Emma across from us, and several of our friends filled the other seats. People we had known for decades, people who had watched Emma grow up, who had been in our home for Thanksgivings and birthdays, who had danced with us at our wedding and sent flowers when Tom's father died. And in that room full of memories, I should have felt safe, should have felt sure. But the thing about betrayal is that it doesn't need darkness or isolation to strike. It can bloom right in the middle of the light, in front of everyone, with a smile on its face. I remember Tom standing up suddenly, his chair scraping back against the floor, and I looked up at him with confusion, thinking maybe he was about to make a toast. Say something sweet about Emma, about our family, about how proud he was. That would have made sense. That would have been kind. That would have been the man I married. But instead, he cleared his throat, tapped a glass with a fork, and as the clinking silenced the table and then rippled out to the rest of the room, I felt something strange in my chest, like the tiniest ripple of cold water had slipped inside me. He said he had something important to say. He said it loudly and clearly, with no shame, no hesitation, as if he had rehearsed every syllable. He looked right at me, not at our daughter, not at the people who loved us, but straight into my eyes, and then, with the calmness of a man announcing a business decision, he said, "I've decided to start a new life. Without you." There was a moment, just half a second, where my ears refused to process it, where everything went muffled like I was underwater, and I thought maybe I'd misheard him. Maybe he'd lost his mind. Maybe this was a cruel joke. But then the silence spread through the room like smoke, and I saw the looks on people's faces. Confusion, pity, disbelief. And that's when I noticed her. Sitting at the far end of our table, next to my friend Marcy, was a woman I didn't recognize right away. But as my mind tried to rearrange the pieces, I realized it was someone I had met once before, briefly, casually. A woman Tom had introduced at a conference dinner as just someone from work. She was sitting too comfortably. She wasn't surprised. Her face had this little twitch of a smile that she was trying to suppress, the kind people wear when they think they've already won. And suddenly, everything inside me fell quiet. Not broken, not angry, just eerily quiet, like the moment before a storm. Emma stood up, her diploma still clutched in her hand, and I saw the confusion on her face melt into something sharper, shock, hurt, maybe even shame. And that's when I knew I couldn't let this moment define her day, couldn't let this ugliness soak into the memory of her graduation. So I stood up too, smoothed the front of my dress, and looked straight at Tom, still smiling that pathetic, proud little smirk of his, like he'd just delivered some great, brave truth. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't ask why. I simply smiled, soft and steady, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Congratulations on your honesty." And then, without another word, I reached into my handbag, pulled out a plain white envelope, and placed it carefully on the table in front of him. His eyes flicked to it, confused, but he didn't pick it up yet. I turned to Emma, kissed her on the cheek, whispered that I loved her more than anything, and walked out of the room with my head held high, leaving behind the stunned silence of people who had no idea what was inside that envelope, but soon would. What happened next, what he found inside, was the moment everything turned. I could still hear the echo of my heels tapping against the marble floor as I stepped into the hallway outside the banquet hall, and for a brief moment I considered turning back, not because I regretted anything, not because I wanted to plead or argue, but because I had this haunting, motherly fear that Emma might fall apart right there, between the bouquets and the cupcakes and the people who once loved us as a family, and I needed her to stay standing just a little longer, just until I could breathe again. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for one deep breath, the kind that scrapes all the way down your ribs and settles like a stone in your stomach. And in that stillness, the silence behind those closed doors suddenly shattered into noise. Gasps, chairs scraping, someone shouting, "What the hell?" And then I heard Tom's voice, loud and cracking, not calm anymore, not smug, but panicked and raw, like a man caught naked in the middle of a storm. I didn't go back in. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what part of that envelope he had opened first. Probably the notarized copy of the financial settlement, the one his lawyer hadn't seen yet, because Tom thought I was still blissfully unaware of his affair, still baking him lasagna and folding his socks like a loyal fool while he played house with his new toy behind my back. But I'd spent the last 3 months preparing for this day, And inside that envelope were the quiet weapons only a woman scorned, but not destroyed, can carry. Every legal document, every signed asset transfer he'd agreed to just in case. Every account with my name now solely on it, and a printed photo tucked in between the papers. Just one. Not for the lawyers, but for his pride. A photo of him and his girlfriend kissing in a hotel lobby 3 towns over. Time stamped and high resolution. Taken by the private investigator I had hired the same day I found the strange credit card charge for business dinner at a spa resort we'd never been to together. What I hadn't expected, though, was the eruption inside the hall. Later, my friend Marcy told me how Tom's voice started rising, how he'd flung the envelope down and stood up so fast his chair toppled backward, yelling my name like I had just done something obscene in front of the entire town. His girlfriend tried to stand up too, maybe to calm him down, maybe to save her own face, but by then everyone had figured out who she was, and a few of the women at our table, God bless them, shifted their chairs away from her with the kind of silent judgment that says more than words ever could. Emma, poor Emma, looked frozen for a moment, her face pale, eyes wide like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. And for one awful second, she took a step toward him, as if to ask him why, or maybe to beg him to stop. But then, right as I imagined her voice cracking or her knees buckling, she turned away and walked out of the room, not toward me, not toward anyone, just away. And then came the moment that nearly undid me. As I stood quietly just outside, trying not to fall apart, I heard footsteps rushing toward the exit. Fast, unsteady, and I braced myself, thinking it was Emma, thinking I would have to hold her while she broke, thinking she would scream or sob or beg me to tell her this wasn't real. But when the doors flung open, it wasn't her. It was Tom. His face was red, eyes wild, holding the envelope in one hand like it was poison, and he looked straight at me like I was the villain in some story he hadn't even begun to understand. He opened his mouth, ready to yell, maybe even to lunge toward me, but that's when the school's head administrator, a tall, dignified woman named Karen, who had known Emma since kindergarten, stepped calmly between us and said, in a tone so calm it was terrifying, "Sir, you need to lower your voice. This is a school event. Please leave if you can't compose yourself." He blinked at her like he didn't understand the language she was speaking, and for a second, his whole body trembled like a man about to explode, but he didn't. He looked back at me one more time, not with rage, not even with sorrow, but with the dawning horror of someone realizing too late that the game he thought he was playing had already ended, and he'd lost. He turned away without another word, stormed down the hallway, and disappeared out the door. And just like that, the noise faded again. I stayed there, completely still, with my hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the strange electricity that rushes through you when everything that was ever uncertain suddenly becomes clear. I wasn't sad. I wasn't broken. I was free. It all started, I think, on one of those late February mornings when the air outside still bites, but the sun tricks you into thinking spring is just around the corner, and you wake up hoping for lightness, but instead find a strange emptiness in the room, not because anything is missing exactly, but because something no longer feels present. Tom had been acting distant, not in the dramatic, obvious way that men in movies behave when they're cheating, but in the quiet, subtle ways that are easy to dismiss if you're still holding on to the belief that your marriage is just going through another season of silence. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped drinking coffee with me in the morning. He stopped doing the little things that husbands do when they're still emotionally in the room, touching your lower back when they walk by, laughing at jokes they've heard 100 times, remembering to buy the brand of milk you like without you having to ask. At first, I made excuses for him. I told myself he was stressed at work, distracted by Emma's upcoming graduation, maybe even dealing with something health-related that he was too proud to talk about. But as the days passed, the distance only grew, and I began to notice patterns. Phone calls that he'd leave the room to take, sudden business dinners that never used to exist, a new password on his laptop that he casually brushed off as a company security requirement. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Truly, I did, because after 22 years of shared mornings, burnt dinners, and late-night laundry folding, you don't just assume betrayal. You assume fatigue, distraction, maybe even a midlife slump. But then there was the hotel charge. It came through on our shared credit card statement, tucked between the grocery bill and the car maintenance payment, a single night at a place 2 hours away that neither of us had mentioned. And when I asked him casually about it later that evening, soft voice, careful tone, he shrugged it off as a mistake, said it must have been a company expense that accidentally landed on the wrong card. And I wanted so badly to believe him, but his eyes didn't meet mine, and something in my chest tightened, like a wire pulled too taut. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to him while he snored softly, turned away from me, and I stared at the ceiling, wondering if this was what the beginning of the end felt like. Not like an explosion, but like a slow leak of air, something invisible draining out until the room felt hollow. The next morning, I called a friend who had once gone through something similar, a quiet divorce after 30 years of marriage that no one had seen coming, and I asked her, without asking, how she knew it was time to look deeper. She didn't give advice, just a number, a private investigator, a woman she said was discreet, professional, and most importantly, honest. I didn't rush. I took a week to think, to pray, to watch. I told myself that if I found nothing, I would burn the reports, delete the photos, never speak of it again. But if I found something, if what I feared was real, then I would protect myself, protect my daughter, and build an exit that wouldn't leave me stripped and humiliated in front of the world. The investigator worked fast. Within 2 weeks, she had everything: photos, phone records, receipts. She gave me a neatly organized folder, the kind you'd expect to receive from a real estate agent. Only this one contained proof that the man I had trusted with my youth, my body, and my future had been giving pieces of himself to someone else behind closed doors and hotel curtains. There was even a short video, nothing explicit, just him holding the woman's hand in a parking lot, brushing her hair off her face, laughing in a way he hadn't laughed with me in years. That was the hardest part. Not the kissing, not the hotel, but the ease, the joy. He looked like a man who had stepped out of responsibility and into freedom. And the cruelest thing was realizing he never looked that free when he was with me. But I didn't cry, not right away. I stared at those photos with a strange calm, like I was looking at a version of my life that belonged to someone else, a stranger, who happened to wear my skin and share my name. I closed the folder and made a decision, not to confront him, not to beg or accuse, but to prepare. I called my lawyer the next day, someone I had used years ago when we were setting up our wills. I told her everything. She was kind, calm, and efficient. We drew up documents, separated finances, restructured assets, and did everything legally and cleanly, making sure I would be protected when the time came. I didn't tell a soul, not even Emma, not yet, because I wasn't planning a scene. And I waited, not out of impulse, but for the moment that would truly matter. The day meant to celebrate our daughter's future quietly became the day I recognized the full truth of my own. It's one thing to uncover the facts through documents, blurry photos taken from afar, or rows of data on a spreadsheet, all cold and impersonal, like the truth is just another file to store away. But it's something entirely different to feel it in someone's silence, in the shift of a shared glance, in the space between two people who used to be each other's world, to stand beside someone you once called your home and realize that the version of them you carried in your heart has long since faded, and in their place now stands someone distant, familiar only in appearance. I thought the folder I had collected told me everything I needed to know, but life has a way of offering clarity when you least expect it, and maybe, deep down, I still needed that last confirmation, the quiet turning point that would allow me to let go of what little remained. It happened on a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind where the sky feels close and the air carries the scent of wet pavement and unfinished plans. I'd taken the day off work under the pretext of a dentist appointment, which wasn't entirely untrue, though the real reason was simpler. I couldn't face another day of polite conversation and forced smiles, pretending everything in my life was still intact. I was parked outside his office building, not to track him, or so I tried to believe, but because part of me needed to know whether the doubts were still just shadows or something real, whether he'd truly be working late, as he said, or whether there would be another unexplained receipt tomorrow, out of place with his evening stories. I waited for nearly 40 minutes, sipping lukewarm coffee, watching people come and go beneath a sea of umbrellas, feeling caught somewhere between logic and emotion. And then I saw him. He stepped out just after 4, unhurried, not glancing around, not walking like someone eager to get home. And behind him was the woman I'd already seen in the photos, younger than me by a few years perhaps, with that curated, effortless look that comes from hours of subtle effort. She laughed at something he said, her hand briefly touching his arm, a gesture I once knew by heart, and he leaned in slightly as they turned the corner together and disappeared into the parking garage. He didn't look back. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. That moment was enough, because seeing it, watching it play out in real time under the heavy gray sky, felt like the last layer of fog lifting from my mind, and in its place came this sharp, bitter clarity that settled into my spine like steel. There was no more guessing, no more hoping he'd snap out of it, no more pretending this was just some midlife crisis he'd eventually regret and come crawling back from. He had made his choice, and now I was making mine. That evening, when he came home, he kissed me on the cheek like he always did, tossed his keys in the bowl by the door, and asked what was for dinner, and I smiled politely, told him it was lasagna, his favorite, and I watched him eat it with the same mouth that had just whispered lies into someone else's ear. He didn't know that everything in our house had already started to shift, that the joint account was no longer joint, that the mortgage paperwork had been quietly amended, that the family lawyer he thought worked for both of us was now working only for me. He didn't see the changes because he wasn't looking, too busy chasing his fantasy to notice that the real world he was leaving behind was already closing its doors. Over the next few weeks, I played the role of the wife he thought he'd left behind emotionally, but hadn't yet left physically. I cooked his meals. I folded his laundry. I smiled at neighborhood events and nodded during conversations about summer vacation plans we both knew weren't going to happen. And all the while, I gathered my strength, piece by piece, until I felt like I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something, a plan, a moment, a reckoning. By the time Emma's graduation rolled around, I was ready. I had everything organized, timed, printed, signed. I had let go of the man I thought I loved, and in his place, I now saw only a man who would need to be taught a very expensive, very public lesson. He thought he was going to blindside me at our daughter's milestone. He thought he was going to step into his new life with a dramatic, triumphant exit. He had no idea that I had already written the ending of his story, and that it wasn't the one he was hoping for. It's a strange thing, preparing for the end of a marriage while your husband still sleeps next to you each night, unaware that the woman he once thought he could fool has already packed her emotions into boxes he'll never open, and is now quietly labeling the exit doors with careful hands and calm intention. There was no rage in me anymore, no raw grief, just a kind of steel-edged focus that allowed me to move through the weeks with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I met with my lawyer twice a week, each meeting a piece of the puzzle falling into place, and with every signature, every notarized form, every asset frozen and account separated, I felt less like a wounded wife, and more like a woman designing the final chapter of a very long and very one-sided story. I wasn't trying to ruin him. I was trying to free myself, to make sure that when the explosion came, I would be the one holding the match, not the one buried in the debris. The house, our house, had always been in both of our names, but after some digging, we found a way, an old clause, a technicality in the loan, to move it into mine alone, which he signed absent-mindedly under the pretense of refinancing for a better rate. The business account he'd tried to keep separate was actually more entangled with our joint funds than he realized, and with the right documentation, we secured half of it under my name without raising a single flag. Every dinner he skipped for a fake meeting, every trip he claimed was for work, gave me more time to build, to calculate, to ensure that the version of freedom he was chasing would come with a price he hadn't anticipated. And the final touch, the one that I tucked in quietly with the rest, was the letter to our daughter, written not in anger, but in truth, explaining what had happened in words that didn't aim to turn her against him, but simply to protect her from being caught in the middle of a lie that wasn't hers to carry. The plan was always to wait until Emma's graduation, because I knew him well enough to know he wouldn't be able to resist making a grand exit on a day that was supposed to be about her. He had always craved attention, always believed he was the smartest man in the room, and I could feel it coming like a thunderstorm, building behind a clear sky. I knew he'd use the ceremony, or the dinner after, to make his announcement, and I knew it wouldn't be for Emma's benefit, but for his own pride. That's why I prepared the envelope, not just with the legal documents and the photographs, but with a final surprise, something he would never expect, something he would only realize when it was too late to change course. What he didn't know was that I had also met with someone else, his girlfriend. I found her number through the investigator, and I reached out under a false name, asking to meet about a possible job offer, something I knew would catch her interest based on her background. She agreed to coffee, and when I showed up and introduced myself, she looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. I told her I wasn't there to beg, to scream, or to threaten. I told her I just wanted her to know what kind of man she was building her life with. I slid the folder across the table. The same photos, the same financial records, but this time with one addition, a timeline. A very clear, very damning timeline that showed how he had been promising her a life together while still sleeping in my bed, telling her she was his future while I was the one paying the bills that kept his fantasy afloat. She didn't speak much, just nodded, lips tight, and I could see her confidence unraveling thread by thread as she flipped through the pages. I didn't care whether she left him or stayed. That wasn't the point. The point was making sure she knew exactly what she was signing up for. And more importantly, that he knew I had taken control of the narrative. So when graduation day came, and he stood up in that hall to make his grand little speech, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. But what I wasn't ready for, what no one could have predicted, was what happened the next morning. Because just when I thought I had delivered the final blow, just when I believed the game was over and the pieces had all fallen into place, I received a phone call that flipped everything upside down. And that's where the real story begins to turn. The morning after Emma's graduation, I woke with a strange sense of stillness in the house, the kind that usually comes after a storm when the sky is washed clean, but you're not quite sure what survived the wind. And for a moment, I just lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet settle into my bones like warm water. I had expected rage, maybe even retaliation, but in those first few hours after handing him the envelope, there was only silence, and I allowed myself to believe, just briefly, that maybe it was over, that he had accepted defeat, realized the damage was done, and would now disappear quietly into the life he thought he wanted. But peace, as I would learn again, is rarely final when pride is still breathing on the other side of the battlefield. It was just past 9 when my phone rang, and the second I saw the number, something inside me shifted, because it wasn't from Tom, and it wasn't from Emma. It was from my lawyer. Her voice was calm, but there was a tension behind it, a certain crispness that made me sit up straighter and grip the phone just a little tighter. She told me that earlier that morning, a motion had been filed in court by Tom's attorney, a counteraction meant to freeze all financial transfers related to our separation, citing claims of coercion, mental distress, and something she referred to as strategic entrapment, which sounded more like a plot twist in a legal drama than anything based in reality. Apparently, he was claiming that I had manipulated him into signing over assets under false pretenses, and that I had colluded with his girlfriend to sabotage his reputation and finances in a deliberate effort to cause public humiliation. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I sat there on the edge of my bed, trying to process what she was saying, my mind racing with the implication. If the court took this seriously, even for a second, it could delay everything, freeze bank accounts, undo property transfers, even call into question my legal right to the house. And worse, it could drag Emma into it, force her into depositions, make her choose sides in a war she never asked to be part of. I hung up the phone and stared at the floor, feeling the first flickers of fear creep up my spine. Not because I thought he would win, but because I knew the damage could still be done in the process. I had underestimated his ego. I thought he would slink away, embarrassed and angry, maybe bitter for a while, but ultimately quiet. I hadn't counted on him going nuclear. Over the next 48 hours, It felt like my entire life was under siege. His lawyer sent demands, threats, and requests for documents that had already been signed and sealed. He began contacting mutual friends, spinning a narrative where I was the manipulator, the cold, calculated woman who had been planning revenge for years, painting himself as the victim of a long-dead marriage and a bitter wife who couldn't handle being left. Some of them believed him, others didn't. But what hurt the most was seeing names I recognized, people I had trusted, suddenly pull away, unsure of who to believe. And then came the worst blow. Emma stopped answering my calls. It was like something inside her had cracked, like the pain of everything that had happened had finally caught up with her, and she no longer wanted to hear explanations or sides or details. She needed space. I understood it. I respected it. But it broke something in me nonetheless. I had done all of this to protect her, to make sure the explosion didn't fall on her shoulders, and now it felt like she was drifting away, swallowed by the smoke of a fire I had tried so hard to control. By the end of that week, I felt cornered, exhausted, like the fight had drained more from me than I realized. Tom, for all his arrogance, had found a way to strike back, not through truth or strength, but through chaos. By twisting the system and the people around us just enough to muddy the waters and turn something clear into something uncertain. For a brief moment, just one, I wondered if I had gone too far. If maybe I should have walked away quietly, let him have his midlife crisis and moved on without a fight. I thought about calling him, about ending it all with a compromise, about choosing peace over principle. But just as I was on the edge of surrender, just when I thought he might actually win, something happened that changed everything. Something I hadn't planned, something he definitely hadn't. And that's when the scales finally tipped for good. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where you don't expect anything more than coffee and stillness. And maybe that's why it hit so hard, because I had finally stopped waiting for justice, stopped looking for some satisfying conclusion, and was starting to accept that maybe the best revenge would simply be surviving with my dignity intact, even if the world around me still believed the lies he was spreading. I had started to let go of the fight, not out of weakness, but because I was tired of giving him space in my head, tired of the endless legal filings and sleepless nights and texts from mutual friends that made me question who was ever really on my side. I was just sitting at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the backyard I once planted with love and now barely recognized, when my phone buzzed with a message that made my heart stop. It was from her, his girlfriend. I hadn't heard from her since the day we met in that coffee shop, when I handed her the folder and walked away without waiting to see the aftermath. I never asked whether she stayed with him or left, and I didn't care to know, because by then I had decided that she was just a detail in the story, not the cause. But now, there she was, and her message was short. She said she wanted to talk, urgently, and that it was about Tom. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to open that door again, but something in me said yes, not because I needed more drama, but because I needed closure. Or maybe, somewhere deep down, I sensed this was going to be the ending I hadn't dared to hope for. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from the polished places where people play pretend and closer to the quiet corners where real things are said. She looked different, tired, thinner, but somehow stronger, and she didn't waste time. She told me that after graduation night, everything between her and Tom had changed, not because of me, not because of guilt, but because she started seeing him for who he really was. The gaslighting, the manipulation, the way he twisted the truth and always made himself the victim. She had started to question everything he said, and it didn't take long before the cracks turned into a collapse. But what she told me next was what truly turned the tide. She said he had asked her to lie in court. He had wanted her to testify that I had threatened her, blackmailed her, and even coerced her into helping with the financial setup. He wanted to paint me as unstable, vindictive, and dangerous. But instead of agreeing, she had recorded their conversation. Every word, every disgusting little detail of his plan to flip the narrative, frame me, and bury me legally and socially. And she brought the recording to me. I sat there, listening to his voice spill out of her phone, smooth, calculated, confident in his own cleverness. and felt the final pieces of this long, painful puzzle lock into place. There it was. Proof, not just of betrayal, not just of manipulation, but of intent, of criminal planning. And this time, it wasn't my word against his. We handed everything to my lawyer. She nearly dropped her coffee when she heard it. Within 48 hours, everything shifted. The motion to freeze the assets was dismissed immediately. His entire case fell apart. My lawyer filed a counterclaim for damages and court costs, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it was his name on the defense, his hands trembling in panic, his voice cracking under oath. The judge, a woman who had seen far too many men like him try to twist the law into a weapon, ruled in my favor without hesitation. He lost everything. Not just the money, not just the house. He lost his standing, his reputation, the illusion that he was in control. People saw him for what he was, not a man starting over, but a coward running from the mess he made. And as for Emma, she came back. Not overnight, not with some grand apology, but slowly, quietly. She called one evening, her voice thick with emotion, and told me she had heard everything. The girlfriend, in a rare act of courage, had reached out to Emma too, shared the truth, showed her the recording, and explained that the woman her father had tried to turn into a villain had never been the enemy. Emma cried, and I cried with her. And then she came home. Now, months later, the house feels different, not because of the furniture or the paint, but because there's peace here again. I still have the folder, tucked in a drawer somewhere, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of the day I stopped being afraid, the day I chose to fight back not with rage, but with truth. And sometimes, when I sit in the garden with Emma by my side, watching the sun go down on everything we've rebuilt, I smile. Not because I won, but because I walked away with everything that mattered.